1838, on a rice plantation in South Carolina, 7 overseers were found dead before sunrise, and every man on the property knew the name of the enslaved man blamed for it. Ezekiel Ransom had no weapon issued to him, no authority, no legal standing, and no reason anyone feared him the night before. Yet by morning, the men who set quotas, ordered whipping, and signed sale papers lay arranged across the land they ruled, their bodies turned into warnings they never imagined facing themselves. The plantation owner had believed obedience meant safety, that silence meant submission, that a man forced to build punishment posts would never decide how they were used. Ezekiel did not run. He waited to be taken. What no one understood then or now was why those 7 died, why it happened in one night, and how a man with nothing left became the most feared slave to ever live. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun hung low and heavy over the rice fields, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. Steam rose from the wet earth as exhausted workers trudged back from another brutal day. Their shoulders slumped under Overseer Caleb Horn's watchful eye. The day's quota had been doubled again, leaving even the strongest laborers stumbling with fatigue. Ezekiel Ransom walked steadily among them, his carpenter's tools balanced carefully across his broad shoulders. Unlike the others, his movements remained measured and precise despite the day's toll. He kept his eyes lowered, maintaining the invisible presence that had become his shield over the years. "Move faster." Horn's voice cracked through the humid air like a whip. "Sun ain't set yet, so you ain't done." He rode alongside the returning workers, his horse's hooves squatching in the mud. Zeke continued his practiced pace toward the carpentry shed, watching through lowered lids as Horn terrorized a young woman who'd stumbled. The overseer's face twisted with familiar pleasure as she scrambled to her feet, terror evident in her movements. The shed stood apart from the other buildings, its walls lined with tools Zeke had maintained meticulously for years. He arranged his implements with deliberate care. Each one returned to its proper place. Through the slats in the wall, he could see the main house glowing with lamplight as darkness settled over the plantation. Voices drifted through the night air as overseers gathered for their evening meeting. Zeke moved silently to the back of the shed, where a loose board allowed him to hear their discussions. He discovered this weakness in the wood years ago, but had carefully maintained it, understanding that knowledge was its own kind of power. "These quotas ain't enough." Pike's growly voice carried clearly. "Old man Rook wants more profit, says we're being too soft." Horn laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "Ain't that the truth? Half these shakis need breaking proper, especially that group from the Miller place." "Speaking of," Willis interjected, "got word from Charleston. Buyer's coming next week for that lot we discussed. Wants the strong ones. No families kept together. Says it's easier that way." "Good," Horn replied. "Been wanting to get rid of that troublemaker Sarah and her brats. Teach them all what happens when they don't know their place." Zeke's hands tightened imperceptibly on the hammer he was cleaning. Sarah's children included a sickly 5-year-old who'd never survived being separated from his mother. He thought of his own Naomi sold south 3 years ago and felt the familiar cold clarity settle over him. The meeting continued as night deepened, the overseers drinking and boasting about their cruelties. Zeke listened to every word, building a map in his mind. 7 men, 7 locations, 7 debts to be paid. He waited until the plantation fell silent, saved for the chorus of insects and the distant splash of gators in the swamp. Moving like a shadow, he left the shed and began his work. Pike was first, found drinking alone in the stable, the same stable where he'd beaten an elderly man to death last month for dropping a feed bag. Zeke's movements were swift and silent. Pike never even turned around. Willis died in the punishment stocks he'd been so fond of using. Morris was discovered in the tool shed, where he'd locked countless people overnight. Thompson met his end in the very rice field where he'd drowned a young boy during a forced night harvest. Each death was methodical, each location chosen with purpose. No screams pierced the night, no alarms were raised, just silence and justice delivered with carpenter's precision. Horn proved harder to find, having passed out drunk in the overseer's quarters. Zeke waited patiently in the shadows until the man stumbled out to relieve himself. The same spot where he'd once forced a woman to stand naked for hours as entertainment, his death was equally humiliating. The last 2 overseers fell before dawn, their bodies positioned as warnings rather than displays. Every death told a story that the living would soon read with trembling recognition. As the first hint of gray touched the eastern sky, Zeke stood in the rice field water. The cool liquid swirled around his ankles as he methodically washed his hands, watching the dark stains dissolve into nothing. His movements were unhurried, almost peaceful. The plantation bell began to ring, its tone frantic and irregular. The first body had been found. Soon the others would be discovered, and the whispers would begin. Zeke continued washing, each finger cleaned with the same care he gave his tools. Behind him, the sun started to rise over the Rook plantation, preparing to illuminate a changed world. The morning sun crept over the horizon, painting Edmund Rook's face in sickly shades as he stared down at Overseer Pike's body. The stable's dirt floor had soaked through with blood, turning black in the dawn light. Rook's hands shook as he accepted a glass of brandy from his trembling house servant. 7? His voice cracked. All 7 overseers? Yes, sir, the plantation doctor confirmed, his face ashen. Each killed differently, but with purpose. He gestured to Pike's positioning. This wasn't random violence. These were executions. More servants and field hands were being herded into rows outside as news spread. The air hummed with tension and barely concealed whispers. White staff members clutched rifles with white-knuckled grips, jumping at every sound. Morris was found in the tool shed. The doctor continued, following Rook as they moved between the bodies. Willis in the stocks, Thompson face down in the rice field, Horn by the quarters. Each one he swallowed hard. Each death seems to mirror something they'd done before. Rook's mind raced. He'd lost 7 overseers in a single night. 7 men who knew how to maintain order, how to keep the machinery of his plantation running. The timing couldn't be worse. He'd just secured new contracts that would require even higher quotas. Outside, the enslaved workers stood in rigid lines under the watch of the remaining white staff. Their faces were carefully blank, but something different lingered in their posture. The usual fear seemed muted, replaced by something more dangerous, hope. Among them stood Ezekiel Ransom, as still and quiet as always. His carpenter's clothes were clean, his expression neutral as he watched the proceedings. 3 years ago, he'd stood in these same rows when they'd sold his wife, Naomi, south. The memory washed over him. Naomi's straight spine as they'd led her away, refusing to break. Even then, she'd caught Overseer Horn's eye by standing up to his advances, by maintaining her dignity. "I ain't his to take," she'd said. A week later, she was gone. "Who did this?" Rook's voice rose as he addressed the assembled workers. "Someone here knows. Someone must have seen something." Silence met his demands, the kind of silence that had weight, that carried meaning. "Whoever is responsible," Rook continued, "will face consequences beyond imagination. But if someone steps forward now, tells us what they know, he let the implied mercy hang in the air." "I did it." The words cut through the morning air, simple and clear. Zeke stepped forward from the line, his movements unhurried. "You." Rook stared at him in disbelief. "You killed 7 men." "Yes, sir." Zeke's voice remained steady. Started with Pike in the stable, ended with Cooper by the creek. Each one died according to their crimes. The admission sent ripples through both the enslaved workers and white staff. Rook's face flushed red with rage and fear. "Hang him now," someone shouted. "Make an example." "No." Zeke's calm didn't waver. According to South Carolina Statute 43, Section 12, damage to property valued over $50 requires a proper trial before any sentence can be carried out. The silence that followed was deafening. Rook's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the ground. Furthermore, Zeke continued. Stat 29, Section 8 states that in cases involving multiple deaths, the accused has the right to present evidence of justification before a magistrate. "You can read," Rook whispered, horror dawning in his eyes. "Yes, sir. Been reading for many years now, laws mostly. Seems important to understand them, don't you think?" The implications crashed over the assembled crowd. An educated slave who knew the law, who had killed with calculation rather than rage, who now stood demanding his legal rights in front of witnesses. "Lock him up," Rook ordered, his voice unsteady. The storage room by the main house posted 4 guards. As they led Zeke away, Rook retreated to his study, pouring another brandy with shaking hands. He'd lost more than 7 overseers today. He'd lost the illusion of control. In the storage room, Zeke sat peacefully on a crate, waiting. Outside his door, the guards shifted nervously, none willing to look through the window at the man who had killed 7 overseers in a single night. Their fear leaked through the walls like water, finding its level. Midday sun blazed through the study windows as Edmund Rook paced before Magistrate Thomas Bell. The distinguished legal official sat primly in a leather chair, dabbing sweat from his brow with a monogrammed handkerchief. 7 men, Thomas. 7 good Christians murdered in their sleep. Rook's voice quivered. We need swift justice, not legal ceremony. Bell adjusted his spectacles with careful precision. The law exists for a reason, Edmund. Even in difficult circumstances. He chose his words delicately. A hasty execution could draw unwanted scrutiny from Charleston. Scrutiny? Rook barked out a harsh laugh. What about my contracts? Who will oversee the harvest now? Every plantation owner in 3 counties will hear about this by week's end. Precisely my concern. Bell's tone remained measured. Word travels quickly. If we handle this improperly, questions will be asked. Questions about how one slave managed to, he trailed off, discomfort evident. Then what do you suggest? Rook demanded. Before Bell could answer, a knock interrupted them. The head house servant entered, bowing slightly. Begging pardon, sir, but the prisoner is asking to speak with the magistrate. Says it's about the law. Rook and Bell exchanged glances. After a moment's hesitation, Bell nodded. Perhaps we should hear what he has to say. Legally speaking, of course. They moved to the storage room where Zeke was held. The space was dim, lit only by thin streams of sunlight through high windows. Zeke sat on his crate, hands folded in his lap, as calm as if he were waiting for Sunday service. You wish to speak about the law? Bell's voice carried forced authority. Yes, sir. Zeke's eyes fixed on the magistrate. I know why you're here. You're wondering if you can skip the trial, avoid the paperwork, but there are witnesses to my request for legal proceedings. The law's clear on that. Bell's eyebrows rose slightly. You seem well versed in legal matters. Had to be, sir. When they sold my wife Naomi, I started learning. Wanted to understand the system that took her. Zeke's voice remained steady. Same system that was going to separate 23 families next week. Rook stiffened. What did you say? The overseers had a list. Children old enough to work were to be sold south. Elderly too weak for full quotas would go to the slave markets in Charleston. Zeke's gaze never wavered. I heard them planning it last night. They were laughing about it. A heavy silence filled the room. Bell shifted uncomfortably, aware of the implications. Mass sales were legal but drew attention, especially when children were involved. You expect us to believe you killed 7 men to protect others? Bell asked. No, sir. I expect you to understand. I killed 7 men because they left me no choice. Zeke's words carried quiet weight. The law you serve gave them that power. The same law I'm asking to judge me now. Bell straightened his jacket, professional mask slipping back into place. Well, proper procedures must be followed, documentation filed, witnesses interviewed. He turned to Rook. It could take several days to arrange a proper hearing. Hope flickered across the faces of the enslaved servants watching from the doorway. Even the guards seemed affected by the magistrate's words. A word in private, Thomas? Rook's tone was tight as he led Bell back toward the study. Behind closed doors, Rook moved to his desk and removed a leather pouch. Gold coins clinked as he set it before Bell. Consider this a retainer, Rook said softly, for your thorough attention to proper legal procedure, however long that might take. Bell stared at the pouch for a long moment before slipping it into his coat. These matters do require careful consideration. Perhaps I should return next week to begin formal proceedings. Next week would be too late. Rook replied meaningfully. Understanding passed between them. Bell nodded once and gathered his things to leave. Neither man noticed the small gap beneath the study door, where sound carried clearly to attentive ears. In the hallway, a house servant silently processed what she'd heard before continuing her work. As sunset painted the storage room walls in deep orange, Zeke sat alone. His fingers traced careful patterns into the wooden wall, symbols that meant nothing to the guards but would speak volumes to others. His expression remained peaceful, even as he heard Rook giving orders outside. Tomorrow night, Rook was saying, after dark, make it quick and quiet. We'll say he tried to escape. Zeke's knife continued its deliberate work, carving meaning into the grain of the wood. The true conflict was only beginning, but he had expected nothing less. The system would try to bury this quickly and quietly. They didn't understand yet. The killing had never been about escape. It had been about teaching them fear. Night settled over the Rook plantation like a heavy blanket, bringing with it an unfamiliar silence. No overseer's whistle pierced the darkness. No patrol boots crunched along the paths between slave quarters. Instead, 3 nervous guards shifted their weight outside a remote storage shed, their lanterns casting jumpy shadows on weathered walls. Inside, Zeke sat with his back against rough boards, listening to the guards' whispered conversation drift through gaps in the planks. Herd Pike was found face down in the rice field, one guard mumbled. Water weren't even knee-deep. That ain't the worst, another replied. Willis was locked in his own punishment box. Key thrown in the muck somewhere. Keep your voices down, the third hissed. He can probably hear us. They fell silent, but the damage was done. The stories were already spreading, carried on night winds from the quarters to the kitchen house to the stables. Each telling gained new details, new meaning. Martha, one of the house servants, brought Zeke his evening meal. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat down the bowl, but her eyes held purpose. Master Rook's message got delivered to 3 plantations already, she whispered, asking for replacement overseers. She paused, glancing at the door. They're saying no. Zeke nodded once, accepting both the information and the cold cornbread she'd snuck beside his regular portion. Martha straightened and left quickly, but not before he saw the flash of satisfaction in her eyes. As midnight approached, more whispers circulated. The field hands who'd been forced to move the bodies spoke in hushed tones about what they'd seen, how Overseer Collins was found trapped in the very stocks he'd used so freely, how Horn's body was discovered in the tool shed where he'd locked countless others for punishment. It wasn't random killing, people said. It was judgment. The guards grew more uneasy as the night wore on, jumping at every rustle in the surrounding brush. They'd heard the stories, too, how 7 men had died without raising an alarm, how no one had heard a sound. Near dawn, a young boy slipped between the slave quarters, passing along what he'd overheard from the house. The planned sales were canceled. No one wanted to risk moving groups of slaves right now, not with what had happened. He knew. The whispers went. He acted to protect us all. The first hints of morning painted the sky when hoofbeats approached the main house. A rider from the neighboring Thompson plantation arrived. His horse othered with sweat from hard riding in the dark. The guards watched him dismount and hurry inside. In the growing light, Zeke could hear raised voices from the main house. The messenger's news echoed across the yard as servants passed it along. 3 overseers from Thompson's plantation had quit that night. 2 more from the Miller estate refused to report for duty. Stories of the killings had reached them, carrying not just fear, but uncomfortable questions. How had one man alone managed to overcome 7 armed overseers? Why had no one heard their struggles? What else might the enslaved people be capable of? The sun rose fully, revealing a plantation transformed. Workers moved through their morning tasks, but their steps were different, lighter, almost. The guards at Zeke's shed looked exhausted from their night of jumping at shadows. Inside, Zeke remained still and calm, aware of every conversation, every movement, every ripple of change spreading outward from the previous night's revelations. He had known fear would travel faster than truth had counted on it. Martha returned with his morning meal, this time accompanied by an older woman named Sarah, who had worked in the main house for decades. Thompson's overseer, Jenkins, took his whole family and left before sunrise. Sarah murmured, adjusting Zeke's water jug. Says he won't work anywhere near here. The others are scared too, Martha added quietly. They're saying no man acts alone like that. Must be others involved. Zeke accepted the food without comment, but his slight nod acknowledged their news. The guards didn't stop the women. They were too focused on watching the tree line, hands tight on their weapons. As the morning advanced, more reports arrived. Other plantations were struggling to maintain order as overseers demanded higher pay for what they now saw as dangerous work. Some refused to patrol at night at all. Fear had taken root. Not the usual fear of whips and chains, but something new. Something that made the overseers check their locks twice. That made them think twice about casual cruelty. The system hadn't changed, but for the first time in memory, those who enforced it were afraid. By mid-morning, Edmund Rook paced the length of his study, pausing occasionally to glare at the empty road leading to the plantation. No wagons appeared, no riders approached. The replacements he'd requested hadn't materialized. 4 more have refused the position. Thomas Bell reported from his seat by the window, his voice carefully neutral. They cite safety concerns. Rook slammed his hand against his desk. Safety concerns. They're armed men, for God's sake. What do they think? 1. He caught himself lowering his voice. What do they think one slave could do? 7 dead overseers provide a rather clear answer to that question. Bell observed quietly. Outside work in the fields had slowed to a crawl. Without overseers to enforce the pace, the enslaved people moved at their own rhythm. Some even dared to rest in the shade when the sun grew too hot. Martha entered with a fresh pitch of water, her movements unhurried. As she poured, she listened carefully to the conversation. "The prisoner wishes to speak with you, Magistrate Bell," she said, her eyes downcast, but her voice steady. "About terms, Rook sputtered. "He's not in any position to. I'll hear him," Bell interrupted, standing. "The law requires we document any testimony before." He left the sentence unfinished. In the storage shed, Zeke sat exactly as he had all morning, straight-backed, composed. Bell settled onto a wooden crate across from him, notebook open. "You understand your situation remains unchanged," Bell began. "I understand that no overseer within 20 member status will take this position," Zeke replied evenly. "I understand that without them, production stops. And I understand that Master Rook cannot afford such a stoppage." Bell's pen paused above the paper. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Better conditions, regular meals, no more night work in the fields. Children under 12 kept with their families." Zeke's voice remained calm, reasonable. "In exchange, work continues. No more violence. You're in no position to guarantee anything," Bell pointed out. "Ask your guards if they're certain of that." Through the afternoon, Bell shuttled between the shed and the main house, carrying proposals and counteroffers. Meanwhile, the plantation remained in limbo. Field hands moved at half speed. House servants took longer with their tasks without overseers to enforce discipline. Small freedoms blossomed. Children played openly between rows of rice plants. Women sang while they worked, not the approved hymns but their own songs. Men stood straighter, looked overground more often. By evening, an uncomfortable agreement had been reached. Rook had little choice. His rice crop wouldn't harvest itself, and no overseers meant no production. Better to yield on some points than lose everything. As darkness fell, activity in the slave quarters increased subtly. Bundles were prepared. Children were kept awake past normal hours, those marked for sale next week. Elderly Sarah, who could no longer keep up. Young James, who'd been caught learning letters. Maria and her 3 small children gathered their few possessions. In his shed, Zeke spoke quietly to Martha as she collected his dinner dishes. His words were few but precise. Directions through the swamp, signs to watch for, where to find food cached along the way. Martha's eyes never left her work, but she absorbed every detail. The guards had grown complacent after the long, quiet day. They huddled closer to their fire as the night air grew chill, paying little attention to the normal sounds of the quarters settling for the night. Just before midnight, shadows moved between the cabins. Sarah led her group of 7, the most vulnerable, the ones who would have been sold first, toward the swamp's edge. They carried nothing that would slow them down. They followed Zeke's instructions exactly. 3 blazed trees marked the safe path. A hollow log held dried meat and a water skin. Most importantly, they knew which parts of the swamp would swallow armed riders and dogs. The quarter moon provided just enough light to navigate by. One by one, the small group disappeared into the darkness. Their absence wouldn't be discovered until morning headcount, and by then they'd be far beyond reach. In his shed, Zeke listened to the night sounds, tracking the escapees' progress by the subtle shifts in frog songs and bird calls. He'd given them the safest route he knew, one he'd spent years memorizing during his night watchman duties. More would follow in the coming nights. Not everyone. That would be too obvious, but enough. The ones most at risk would vanish into the swamp's embrace, carried away by the darkness and Zeke's careful planning. The guards never noticed the extra silence from the quarters, the missing voices in the night chorus. They were too busy watching the shadows, jumping at every rustle in the brush, wondering if they would be next to face judgment. The rain started just after midnight, a gentle patter that muffled footsteps and softened edges. Perfect weather for secrets. Zeke listened from his shed as another group prepared to leave. He could tell by the way the night sounds changed, how certain voices went quiet. Through gaps in the wooden walls, he watched Thomas Harper and his wife Rachel guide their 3 children toward the treine. Behind them came elderly Marcus, who taught Zeke carpentry, moving slowly but steadily. The Willen sisters brought up the rear, supporting their mother between them. The guards huddled deeper into their oilskin coats, faces turned away from the wet wind. They never saw the shadows slipping past, never heard the careful movements through the growing puddles. The rain masked everything. Inside the shed, Zeke remained motionless on his pallet, though every muscle yearned to move, to help, but his stillness was crucial. The guards checked on him regularly, and his presence reassured them that the greatest threat was contained. Martha appeared with his evening meal, later than usual. As she set down the bowl, her fingers tapped a quick pattern against the wood. 3 groups had made it safely past the first marker. Zeke blinked once in acknowledgement. "Still raining hard, sir," Martha said to the nearest guard, her voice carefully pitched to Carrie. "Doubt anyone's moving in this weather." The guard grunted, pulling his coat tighter. Martha's words reinforced his desire to stay by the fire rather than patrol the perimeter. Another small manipulation in a night full of them. Hours crept by. Zeke tracked the escapees' progress through subtle signs, the changing pattern of owl calls, the moments of unusual silence from the swamp's night creatures. He'd taught them well. They moved like water through the darkness, leaving no trace. A shout from the quarters made him tense, but it was only 2 young men arguing over a game of cards, their voices carrying through the wet air. The guards shifted, alert for a moment, then settled back into their weather-induced stupor. The argument was planned, of course. It drew attention away from the back of the quarters where the Wilson family was preparing to leave. Their youngest child was only 4. They needed the extra coverage. Zeke allowed himself a small smile. He'd spent years watching how sound traveled across the plantation, learning which distractions worked best. Now that knowledge was saving lives. Near 3 in the morning, the rain intensified. Lightning flickered in the distance, and thunder rolled across the fields. In the brief flashes of illumination, Zeke caught glimpses of movement. More families taking advantage of nature's cover. One guard stood suddenly, peering into the darkness. "Thought I saw something," he muttered. "Probably just that old hound of yours," his companion replied, not wanting to leave the fire's warmth. "Been running loose since yesterday." Zeke held his breath. The Wilsons would be passing that exact spot. But the guard, chilled and wet, chose to believe the comfortable explanation. He sat back down, cursing the weather. The night continued its slow dance of escape and misdirection. More families slipped away while Zeke remained conspicuously present, allowing himself to be seen whenever the guards checked. His stillness was their security. Around 4 in the morning, a guard finally noticed something amiss. "Awful quiet in the quarters," he said, standing. "Rain's keeping everyone inside." Another replied, "Who'd be fool enough to be out in this?" But the first guard wasn't satisfied. He lit a lantern, its glow weak against the darkness. "Going to check," he announced. Zeke sat up slowly, deliberately drawing attention. "Might want to check the tool shed first," he said quietly. "Heard some strange noises earlier." The guards exchanged glances. The tool shed was in the opposite direction from the quarters. Another choice presented: investigate the dangerous prisoner's warning or trudge through the rain to count sleeping people. They chose the tool shed. By the time they finished searching it and found nothing, the pre-dawn light was beginning to soften the eastern sky. The rain gentled to a drizzle, then stopped. Zeke stood and stretched, joints cracking loudly enough for the guards to hear. He made a show of settling back onto his pallet just as the morning bell began to ring. Soon the absence of nearly 30 people would be discovered, but the rain had washed away any tracks, and the swamp had swallowed all traces of their passage. He could have gone with them. The opportunity had been there multiple times throughout the night, but his presence was essential, both as a distraction and as a symbol. As long as he remained in custody, the plantation's attention stayed focused on him rather than the quiet exodus taking place in the darkness. The first hints of dawn painted the sky pink as Zeke arranged himself carefully on his pallet. He wanted to be found exactly where he was supposed to be when the shouting started. Sometimes the most powerful weapon was simply being seen exactly where your enemies expected you to be. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, evaporating the last traces of night rain. Rook paced the veranda, his face red with fury as overseers reported the numbers. 28 people gone, vanished like mist. The plantation hummed with tension as white men with rifles moved between the buildings, questioning everyone they found. Isaac stood trembling before Rook, his eyes fixed on the wooden boards beneath his feet. 2 guards gripped his arms while Overseer Jenkins pressed a hand against his shoulder, keeping him in place. "One more time," Rook said, his voice dangerously soft. "What did you see?" Isaac's shoulders shook. He'd been standing there for over an hour, repeating the same denial until his throat was raw. But fear was wearing him down, and everyone could see it. "I didn't," Isaac started. But Jenkins's fingers dug deeper into his flesh. "Your brother works at the Wilkins plantation," Jenkins reminded him. "Be a shame if something happened to him. Accidents are common these days." Isaac's resolve crumbled. "It was Zeke," he whispered, the words coming out like poison. He had it all planned, used the rain for cover, had people creating distractions while others escaped. Rook leaned closer. How do you know this? I overheard him talking to Martha about signals about timing. Isaac's voice grew fainter with each word. He stayed behind on purpose to keep everyone watching him instead of he couldn't finish. Tears ran down his face as the weight of his betrayal settled over him. In the distance, Martha was being dragged from the kitchen, her face set in stone as she watched Isaac break. Rook straightened, adjusting his coat. Bring him, he commanded, pointing at Zeke's shed. Let everyone see what happens to those who think themselves clever. Guards swarmed the small building where Zeke was held. They found him sitting calmly on his pallet, as though he'd been expecting them. 4 men with rifles trained on him while others approached with heavy chains. Stand up, Jenkins ordered. Zeke rose slowly, his movements deliberate. He towered over most of the guards, but made himself appear smaller, less threatening, a habit of survival that now served a different purpose. Every moment they underestimated him was another moment he could use. They chained his wrists first, then his ankles. The iron links clinked softly as they led him out into the harsh sunlight. A crowd had gathered, the remaining enslaved workers forced to watch, white overseers standing behind them with weapons ready. Rook waited in the center of the yard, Isaac still trembling beside him. When Zeke was brought forward, their eyes met briefly. There was no anger in Zeke's gaze, only a deep sadness that made Isaac flinch and look away. You've been busy, Rook said, circling Zeke like a predator. Organizing escapes while we thought you safely contained, using our own assumptions against us. Zeke said nothing. His silence seemed to infuriate Rook more than any response could have. Secure him to the post, Rook commanded. Guards dragged Zeke to the whipping post he'd helped build years ago. The chains were wrapped around it, holding him upright, exposed to the growing heat of the day. Rook turned to address the crowd. Let this be a lesson. Your clever friend here thought he could outsmart us. Thought he could empty my plantation while we weren't looking. He pointed at Zeke's chained form. Tomorrow at dawn, he hangs, and his body will remain on display until every last runaway is found. A ripple of fear moved through the crowd, but it wasn't the kind Rook wanted. The enslaved workers stared at Zeke with a mixture of awe and grief, while the white overseers shifted uncomfortably, looking anywhere but at the man they'd have to kill. The sun crawled across the sky. Guards changed shifts, but Zeke remained standing, accepting neither water nor shade when offered. His stillness became unsettling, as though the chains held nothing more substantial than a shadow. As darkness fell, an unnatural quiet settled over the plantation. No songs came from the quarters. No murmured conversations carried on the evening breeze. Even the night birds seemed to hold their voices. The only sounds were the soft clink of chains when Zeke shifted his weight and the nervous footsteps of the guards. Through it all, Isaac sat huddled against the kitchen wall, his betrayal eating at him like acid. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Zeke's face. Not angry, just sad, as though he understood and forgave the fear that had broken him. Somehow, that was worse than hatred would have been. The moon rose, casting strange shadows across the yard. Zeke stood silent in his chains, more presence than prisoner, while the plantation held its breath around him. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring, but for now the night belonged to silence and shame. Dawn crept across the plantation with unusual slowness, as if the sun itself hesitated to witness what was coming. A heavy mist clung to the ground, turning familiar shapes into looming shadows. The air felt thick with dread. Enslaved workers emerged from their quarters in silence, moving like ghosts through the fog. No overseers needed to force them to gather. They came of their own accord, forming neat rows facing the execution ground. Their faces were carefully blank, but their eyes never left Zeke's form, still chained to the post where he'd spent the night. Rook emerged from the main house, his usually pristine coat wrinkled from a sleepless night. Dark circles shadowed his eyes as he surveyed the scene. 6 armed guards flanked him, their rifles held tight against their chests. "Jenkins," Rook called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Prepare the rope." Overseer Jenkins didn't move from where he stood at the edge of the crowd. His hands worked nervously at his belt. "Sir," he said barely loud enough to hear. I can't." Rook's face flushed red. "What did you say?" "I won't do it, sir." Jenkins's voice grew stronger. "My contract is for managing fieldwork, not this." Your contract is for whatever I say it is. Rook spun to face another overseer. Williams, you do it. Williams took a step backward, shaking his head. No, sir. I won't hang a man for protecting his people. Contract or no contract. One by one, the remaining overseers found reasons to look away, to shuffle their feet, to examine the ground. None stepped forward. The silence grew heavier with each passing moment. Zeke hadn't moved or spoken. The chains still held him upright, but there was something different about his posture now, less like a prisoner and more like a man choosing to stay exactly where he was. Cowards! Rook shouted. All of you! He stormed across the yard, snatching a rope from the ground. I'll do it myself. He approached the post where Zeke stood, but his hands shook so badly he couldn't manage the knot. The rope slipped through his fingers once, twice, 3 times. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning chill. Zeke turned his head slightly, looking down at Rook with those calm, sad eyes that had unnerved so many. Rook stumbled backward as if struck. Someone! Rook's voice cracked. Someone help me with this! No one moved. The enslaved workers stood like statues, their collective silence more powerful than any shout could have been. The overseers found urgent reasons to be elsewhere, drifting away one by one until only Jenkins remained, and even he wouldn't meet Rook's gaze. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Still, no one moved to help. Rook's commands grew more desperate, then shifted to promises of extra pay. Then to threats of firing. Nothing worked. "This is my plantation," he screamed, his composure completely shattered. "I am in charge here." But his words rang hollow in the heavy air. The power he'd thought was his had evaporated like the morning dew, leaving him alone with a useless rope and hundreds of steady eyes watching his failure. A horse's hooves sounded on the packed earth of the drive. Magistrate Bell rode up looking troubled. He took in the scene. Rook standing alone with a rope. The silent crowd. Zeke still chained but somehow appearing more free than anyone else present. Rook Bell called out, dismounting quickly. "A word, if you please. Privately." Rook stood frozen for a moment longer, then let the rope fall from his nerveless fingers. He followed Bell to the shade of a nearby oak where they spoke in hushed, urgent tones. The conversation lasted several minutes with Bell doing most of the talking, and Rook's shoulders slumping further with each word. Finally, Rook turned back to the crowd. His voice was barely carrying across the yard. "The execution is canceled. Return to your work." No one moved immediately. They waited, watching until Jenkins stepped forward with the key to Zeke's chains. Only when the last iron link fell away did the crowd begin to disperse, moving with the same eerie silence they'd maintained all morning. Zeke rubbed his wrists where the chains had bit into them. His face showed no triumph, no relief, only the same calm acceptance he'd worn throughout his captivity. He looked at Rook once, a long, steady gaze that made the plantation owner turn away first, then walked slowly toward the carpentry shed, as if nothing unusual had happened. The morning sun climbed higher, harsh and bright in a cloudless sky. The execution ground stood empty, except for the fallen rope, already gathering dust in the Carolina heat. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Magistrate Bell's carriage rolled away from Rook Plantation. Inside, Zeke sat quietly, his wrists free of chains, but his ankles shackled. Bell had insisted on the minimal restraints, more for appearance than necessity. They both knew Zeke wouldn't run. Through the carriage window, Zeke watched the familiar fields shrink into the distance. Rice stalks swayed in the hot breeze, their golden heads nodding as if in farewell. He'd worked those fields for 20 years, knew every ditch and levee, every hidden path through the marsh. Bell cleared his throat. "The sale papers are complete. You'll be transported to Philadelphia under my authority." He paused, studying Zeke's impassive face. "It was the best compromise I could manage." Rook wanted. He trailed off. "Rook wanted me dead." Zeke finished simply. "But fear is stronger than hate." Bell nodded uncomfortably. They rode in silence for several miles, the carriage wheels crunching on packed dirt. Back at Rook Plantation, changes were already rippling through the established order. The remaining overseers moved cautiously among the workers, their whips tucked away, their voices notably softer. When young Mary dropped a basket of cotton, no one raised a hand to her. The overseer simply ordered her to clean up the mess and move on. In the main house, Rook sat at his desk, pen hovering over ledgers as he calculated the cost of reduced productivity against the risk of another uprising. The numbers didn't matter. He'd lost something more valuable than profits. The illusion of absolute control had shattered like fine china, leaving him to sweep up the pieces. Word spread quickly through the whisper network that connected plantation to plantation. Overseers began demanding higher wages, refusing night shifts, requesting to work in pairs. Some simply disappeared, leaving notes of resignation. The brutal efficiency that had made the low-country rice plantations infamous began to crack. A week after Zeke's departure, Jenkins stood watching the evening work crew. A young man named Samuel was struggling with a heavy load. Before, Jenkins would have shouted, threatened, maybe worse. Now he just called out, "Take 2 trips if you need to." The memory of 7 dead overseers kept his hand from his whip. The carriage carrying Zeke traveled steadily northward. They stopped at designated safe houses, places Bell assured him were trustworthy. At each stop, Zeke noticed how the story of his actions had preceded him. People watched him with a mixture of awe and unease, whispering about the man who'd killed 7 overseers in one night. 2 weeks into the journey, they crossed into Virginia. The landscape changed, fields giving way to rolling hills. The air grew cooler, carrying hints of autumn. Zeke spent most of the time in silence, but his mind was active, recording every detail, every change in terrain. Back in South Carolina, the ripples continued to spread. Children on neighboring plantations whispered his name like a talisman. Parents told careful versions of his story, emphasizing not the violence, but the protection he'd provided. He did what he did to save families, they'd say softly in the dark. He showed them we're not just property to be broken. The old ways didn't disappear overnight, but they shifted. Overseers who'd once ruled through terror now found themselves looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows. Every rustle in the dark made them remember how 7 of their colleagues had died silently, efficiently, without raising a single alarm. 3 weeks after leaving Rook Plantation, the carriage approached the Pennsylvania border. Bell had been increasingly nervous as they moved further north, but Zeke maintained his characteristic calm. The shackles had been removed 2 days earlier, a necessary precaution as they entered free territory. The border itself was unremarkable. No line in the dirt, no wall, no obvious marker. But Zeke felt the change in his bones as they crossed over. The air itself seemed different, lighter somehow, though the weight of everything he'd done and everything he'd left behind still pressed on his shoulders. Their carriage passed a small farm where a black man worked freely in his own field. The man looked up, nodded at them as equals. Zeke nodded back, his face showing no emotion, but his hands tightened slightly on his knees. The distance between that man and the shackled workers of Rook Plantation could be measured in more than just miles. The afternoon light slanted through the trees, casting long shadows across the road. They were scheduled to reach Philadelphia by nightfall. Zeke watched the countryside roll past, his expression unchanging. He was leaving behind more than a plantation. He was leaving behind a legend that would continue to grow without him. 10 years had passed since Ezekiel Ransom left South Carolina. On a muggy evening at the Carter Plantation, children gathered in the shadows behind the cabins. Voices hushed as the oldest among them, a girl named Sarah, told the story everyone knew by heart. "They say he killed 7 overseers in a single night," she whispered, the younger ones leaning in close. Not out of anger, but to protect families from being sold apart. He didn't run or hide. He walked right up and admitted what he'd done. A small boy named Jacob clutched his knees. "Did they hang him?" Sarah shook her head. "They couldn't. No overseer would do it. They were too scared. Even the white folks were afraid. That's why things changed." The changes were real, even if subtle. On the Carter Plantation, like many others across the Lowcountry, the worst excesses of overseer cruelty had faded. Public whippings grew rare. Family separations decreased, not from kindness, from fear. Old Joshua, who remembered Zeke, sat on his cabin step, watching the children disperse as darkness fell. He recalled how the system had shifted after that night. Overseers started working in pairs, jumping at shadows. They'd learned that brutality could be answered with brutality. The lesson had cost 7 lives. Word had spread beyond South Carolina's borders. When new overseers arrived from Georgia or North Carolina, they'd hear whispered warnings. "Remember Ransom." The name became both warning and promise, a reminder that even the most seemingly docile slave might harbor deadly purpose. Up in Philadelphia, Zeke had built a quiet life. His carpentry skills earned him steady work, and his deliberate manner put clients at ease. Few suspected this gay-haired craftsman was the same man whose actions had sent tremors through the plantation system. His hands, weathered now by age and freedom rather than bondage, still moved with careful precision. The skills he'd once used to build whipping posts and repair stocks now created fine furniture. His latest piece was a cradle, its curves smooth and gentle. But his eyes hadn't changed. They still watched everything, missing nothing. He noted how free blacks moved differently here. Straighter backs, less hesitation. He saw the fear in white faces when race riots erupted in other cities. The old power dynamics weren't gone, just shifted. Letters sometimes reached him through the underground network, carried by trusted hands. They told of changes back south. Overseers who once ruled through terror now watched their own backs. Plantation owners calculated the cost of cruelty against the risk of another ransom. Fear had become a currency that traded both ways. Some nights Zeke would sit in his small room above the carpenter's shop, running his fingers over the scars on his back. He never spoke of regret. The 7 deaths still weighed on him, but not as sins, as necessary acts in a deeper moral calculation. A Methodist preacher once tried to counsel him toward repentance. Zeke had listened politely, then said simply, "Some debts can only be paid in blood. I didn't choose the currency, they did." In the markets and shops of Philadelphia, he sometimes overheard snippets of debate about slavery, abolition, legal reform. Well-dressed white people argued philosophy while sipping tea. Zeke would continue his work silently, knowing what they didn't. Systems built on fear only understood the language of fear. His legend grew without him. Back on the plantations, parents taught their children to be careful, watchful, patient, like Ransom was. Overseers warned each other not to push too hard, not to break too many spirits. You never know who's watching, learning, waiting. The story changed in the telling. Sometimes he was 8 tall, sometimes he could vanish like smoke. But the core truth remained. A man they thought they'd broken had broken them instead. A man they'd tried to make invisible had become unforgettable. Zeke took no pleasure in his reputation, but he understood its value. Fear was a tool like any other. He'd learned that lesson from his captors. The difference was, he'd used it with purpose, not for cruelty's sake, but to force change. His hair had gone mostly gray now, his movements slower but no less precise. Young activists sometimes sought him out, hoping for inspiration or guidance. He offered neither. His methods belonged to desperate times, he told them. The future needed different weapons, but on warm nights when the air felt like South Carolina, he'd sit on his small balcony and remember the rice fields swaying in the dark, the silence before dawn. 7 men who thought they owned the night, learning too late they didn't. The look in Rook's eyes when he realized fear had changed masters. Zeke would touch the rough carpenter's calluses on his palms. Honest work, freely chosen. These hands had dealt death, but they'd also carved a path to something better. Not just for him, but for hundreds who never knew his name, only his legend. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day. 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 Have a great